Hello and good afternoon from Brussels, and welcome to this SolarPower Europe webinar, Growing Public Procurement Demand for Sustainable Photovoltaics. My name is Raffaele Rossi, and I work at SolarPower Europe as a policy analyst, and I'm very much looking forward to this webinar and to introducing our distinguished speakers. The objective of today's webinar is to get some insights on the characteristics that make PV modules and inverters classifiable as sustainable, and to discuss on the steps that purchasers and manufacturers can take to make sustainable PV as a key part of their renewable energy solution. Specifically in today's webinar, we will hear about the new product category for PV launched by EPEAT, which is the global eco-label for the IT sector, and the criteria that are used in the label. So I'm really glad to welcome our panelists today, Nancy Gillis, the CEO of the Green Electronic Council, and Andreas Radha, Global Sustainability Director at First Solar and the Chair of the Sustainability Task Force at SolarPower Europe. The two presentations will be followed by a short Q&A session where you can ask the speakers for more information or clarifications. And just before we start, a few housekeeping rules. If you have attended any of our previous webinars, the rules are the same. So if you have any question, you can type them using the tool on the right-hand side of your screen. And a reminder to please do it in the questions box, not in the chat box. As said, we will try to address your questions during the Q&A session that will take place after the presentation. Shortly after the end of the webinar, we will share the slides and the recording of the webinar with you. So you will receive everything in your mailbox shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. That would be it from my side. So without further ado, now I wish you all a good webinar, and I leave the floor to Nancy to start with her presentation. So please, Nancy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you very much to SolarPower Europe for this opportunity for this webinar. My name is Nancy Gillis. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Electronics Council. The Green Electronics Council is a mission-driven nonprofit organization that is focused on a world of only sustainable IT products and services. Next slide. Great. Now, we do seek to achieve, as I said, a world in which there are only credible, sustainable IT products and services. And we seek to create that world by supporting large-scale institutional purchasers. Next slide. The way that we support those institutional purchasers is by providing a number of freely available tools and resources. We feel that as a mission-driven nonprofit organization, in supporting institutional purchasers, we're creating market demand for credible, sustainable IT products and services. So in that way, the Green Electronics Council is the balance between those who buy and those who make. And just some of those free available tools and resources that we have for purchasers who engage with us. And again, we are a global mission-driven nonprofit, so we do support purchasers, public and private sector, in more than 42 countries. And the tools and resources we provide them with are examples of sustainable procurement policy that they can use themselves, contract language examples of how to actually specify sustainable IT products and services throughout the procurement, purchaser guides, which are guides that actually address topics that purchasers increasingly are interested in. Examples include purchaser guides on how to address labor and human rights in the electronic supply chain, how to buy sustainable cloud services, and a purchaser guide that we're launching January of next year, how do you actually buy in support of the circular economy? We are best known, though, for our eco-label called EPEAT. EPEAT is an eco-label. It is a Type 1 eco-label, and again, has been in use for more than a decade. and also is available for both private and public sector purchasers in more than 42 countries. Now, EPEAT covers at this time 5 product categories: computers and displays, imaging equipment, televisions, mobile phones, and servers. And we are very proud to announce that we will be launching no later than June of next year a category focused on sustainable photovoltaic modules and inverters. Now, the Green Electronics Council does not launch a category without documented understanding that there's purchaser interest. So why are purchasers interested in sustainable photovoltaic modules and inverters? Purchasers are interested for a number of reasons. The first, of course, as you see on this chart, is that there has been a significant increase in the number of photovoltaic modules that have been installed, not only, as you will see here, in China, but just globally. And it is those photovoltaic modules that are understood to also be a potential source of lead, cadmium, and toxic chemicals. And these are chemicals that are of concern not only to purchasers, but of course, any individual interested in the environmental well-being of their community and the planet. And so in addition to this increase in the number of actual photovoltaic modules that have been installed globally, we also start seeing that photovoltaic modules are becoming an increasing percentage of the global e-waste stream. In fact, there is an estimation that solar panels themselves could reach up to 78 million metric tons of e-waste by 2050. And so purchasers recognize the value of renewable energy. They recognize the value of solar energy as part of renewables, but they also do not want that benefit of renewable energy based on solar to be coming from a non-sustainable base. And so increasingly, those purchasers who are responding to the increased availability of solar energy are also asking about whether or not that is based on an unsustainable base. And therefore, we, the Green Electronics Council, have documented interest in credible, sustainable photovoltaic modules and inverters. So with purchasers caring, purchasers care about a number of sustainability impacts that the Green Electronics Council, and particularly our eco-label EPEAT, address. Obviously an interest in climate change, and so some of the impacts that any EPEAT product category covers will be addressing climate change. It will be addressing chemicals, not only regulatory requirements in the area of chemicals, but also trying to find safer chemicals to use as part of the product manufacture and assembly process and within the product itself. Any EP product category will look at resource consumption. And of course, as I just spoke about, since e-waste is the growing waste stream globally, many of the purchasers' interest focus on end of life and how do products get successfully managed at their end of life. And of course, the EPEAT Eco-Label addresses end of life concerns as well. But the EPEAT Eco-Label is a sustainability eco-label, so it does not only address environmental impacts, it also addresses social impacts as well. And the way that EPEAT differs from other eco-labels is its use of both required and optional criteria. The Green Electronics Council recognizes that there's no greater source for innovation than industry. And as such, the EPEAT Eco-Label has been built to not only have products meet a required set of criteria, making them credibly sustainable, but also the opportunity to meet optional criteria. These are criteria that a manufacturer can choose to meet in these areas of sustainability impact to show their commitment to sustainability and to allow them to innovate in the space of sustainability. So I've spoken about those manufacturers and EPEAT being a successful eco-label. So what manufacturers already make their products available under EPEAT in the categories where EPEAT covers products? As you see here, this is a list of manufacturers as of October of this year, and more than 60 brands participate in the EPEAT eco-label. In fact, more brands participate in EPEAT than in any other eco-label in the electronics and IT sector. And by having more brands participate, it means that there are more products available to purchasers. And having product diversity and product availability is essential, particularly to public purchasers who, to have a fair and open competition, normally require at least 3 manufacturers having products available. So we are very proud that we have so many manufacturers, but it's because, of course, we have so many purchasers who value the EPEAT brand. And we're also very proud that the EPEAT eco-label not only offers purchasers access to products from major global brands, we also make sure that there are products available from small and medium businesses, because purchasers frequently want to support the lifeblood of their local economic development by supporting domestic small and medium businesses as well. And the Green Electronics Council, as a mission-driven nonprofit, supports those goals. Now, the Green Electronics Council also understands the importance of how the EPEAT criteria are created. Next slide, please. The EPEAT criteria are created first and foremost in a balanced voluntary consensus process. This means that the Green Electronics Council is focused on bringing the necessary voices to the table. That not only includes, of course, manufacturers who are ultimately responsible for making the products that meet the EPEAT criteria, but it also includes purchasers, nonprofits, academic institutions, and policy representatives. And the EPEAT eco-label is a life cycle eco-label. It seeks to address environmental and social impacts throughout the 5 phases of a product's life cycle, both how the materials are extracted, the manufacture and assembly of those products, the use of the products, and then, of course, both the life elongation of the product, so trying to keep that product available as long as possible before, of course, then going to end of life and recycling. And the EPEAT eco-label not only looks at the product itself, so product attributes, but also the behavior of the manufacturers, corporate attributes. It's these 2 things that differentiate the EPEAT eco-label from other eco-labels in the sector. And not only are the EPEAT products just considered EPEAT, EPEAT eco-label is a tiered eco-label. So what you want to see here is that, as I stated, EPEAT has a number of required criteria, and no product can claim to be an EPEAT registered product unless it meets those required criteria. This allows purchasers to be confident that when they are buying an EPEAT registered product, they truly are buying a more sustainable product than a non-EPEAT registered product. But EPEAT is set up to benefit from the innovation that's happening in the marketplace. And so as products seek to meet more of the optional criteria, they become products that are registered at higher tiers within EPEAT. As you see here, a product that meets both required and less than 50% of optional criteria is considered bronze. One that meets 50 to 75% of optional criteria is silver. And then products in which manufacturers are committed to maximizing innovation in this space, those are products that meet more than 75% of optional criteria and fall within the gold tier. Now, EPEAT is not only excited about the fact that it provides purchasers more product availability than any other eco-label, we're also excited that EPEAT serves the needs of purchasers in other ways as well. Next slide, please. By buying EPEAT registered products, purchasers, again, both public and private sector, can use that purchasing decision as part of their organizational sustainability reporting. That means that purchasers who choose to buy EPEAT registered products can use those purchases as they report to the GRI, one of the major sustainability reporting protocols globally, to report to CDP, again, a major sustainability reporting protocol, this one driven by investors. And of course, there's documented increasing interest by investors on how organizations address sustainability. Purchasers who are buying EPEAT registered products can also use that purchasing as part of their reporting to the UN Global Compact. And then purchasers who are buying EPEAT registered products can also use that information as they report to the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, by buying EPEAT registered products, it is the EPEAT criteria that help purchasers talk about how their purchasing decisions are meeting the Sustainable Development Goal number 8, focusing on supply chain transparency and affording a secure working environment for workers within the manufacture and assembly of products. For SDG 11, seeking to achieve a more environmental city environment, making cities more healthy and secure for citizens. And then SDG 12, focused on addressing the largest growing waste stream globally, which is the e-waste stream. So the Green Electronics Council has documented purchasers' interest in credible, sustainable photovoltaic modules and inverters. We are proud to be able to work in launching a photovoltaic module and inverter category no later than June of 2020. And we understand that in doing so, we not only help purchasers secure renewable energy on a sustainable base, but also allow them to communicate their purchasing decisions in a number of reporting protocols. With that, let me hand it over to the next speaker.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Nancy, and thanks to the SolarPower Europe team for hosting this webinar today. My name is Andreas Radha. I'm the Global Sustainability Director with First Solar and also elected chair of the SolarPower Europe Sustainability Task Force. And I would like to take this opportunity to provide a perspective from a manufacturer of PV modules and a provider of integrated PV system solutions on the possibility of increasing the demand for sustainable photovoltaics from a purchaser's perspective, and also give you a bit of an idea on why this matters from a manufacturer perspective like ours as First Solar. In addition to that, I would also like to get into a bit more detail and present some more details on how the sustainability performance of photovoltaic modules and inverters can be measured within the EPEAT category which Nancy just lined out, and how this all maps into a number of global and regional initiatives in the EU, but also elsewhere in the globe when it comes to supporting sustainable product policies on a regulatory framework. So with that, let me move to my next slide here. And basically start with the perspective I just mentioned. How does it all map into ongoing initiatives? And let me maybe zoom a little bit into the European landscape as we are speaking within the webinar of SolarPower Europe. I think for quite a few attendants this might be an interesting chart, and I would like to give a bit of an update on where we stand here. As some of you might know, the European Commission has initiated that integrated eco-design, eco-labeling, green public procurement, and energy labeling process for photovoltaic modules, inverters, and systems a couple of years ago. And as we speak, we're basically expecting some form of policy recommendation coming out of the European Commission on how to go forward here. And in a way that is kind of mirroring a little bit what Nancy just mentioned. There is an increasing demand, obviously, in the market for understanding the sustainability profile of PV-related products, i.e. the modules, the inverters, and the systems, and enabling some form of comparability of products and the transparency of environmental and sustainability performance, so as to enable and empower consumers, be it institutional purchasers, be it private purchasers, and ultimately the consumers, to make a choice for more sustainable products. The second objective, which is an underlying motivation for these policy regulatory discussions happening in the EU right now, is to obviously help to effectively identify and address environmental hotspots throughout the life cycle of these products, right? So if you think about the sustainability performance of the product, you obviously have to think not only from the product itself, but you have to map into the raw material supply throughout the supply chain, the use of energy to produce the product, the production itself, the use phase, and then the end of life phase, to be able to quantify that. And then obviously the interest should be, and this obviously comes at a perfect point in time, as just today we have heard about the European Green Deal being announced by the European Commission, putting an even stronger emphasis on the sustainability in the EU economy going forward the next couple of years. So the underlying motivation really being to shift that product distribution curve, which is displayed in this graph here, towards products with a higher sustainability, right? So incentivizing that shift through these policy instruments is a clear objective here as well. And that is obviously also the underlying principle of EPEAT, as Nancy just lined out. And that was also a clear motivation on embarking into the development of these criteria over the last couple of years in the context of developing this leadership standard for PV modules and inverters, which I will go into more detail on the next couple of slides. So before moving on, just maybe very, very quickly in terms of how EPEAT would compare to potential EU product policies. So I would say, and we can certainly address that probably in the Q&A in a bit more detail, that with the launch of the EPEAT category, we obviously have an opportunity to kind of streamline and hopefully, create synergies to a potential EU eco-label for photovoltaic modules, which might be one of the proposals deemed feasible by the European Commission as a policy instrument going forward for the European Union, right? So I think in that sense, EPEAT offers the excellent opportunity for manufacturers to kind of go through that certification process, and then hopefully in the development of the EU eco-label criteria, provide that leverage to the European Commission. And I know that discussions have been going on there already in the background. So I think it is a complementary initiative here, which will help to raise some synergies and harmonization on a global level. So taking a step back and just kind of trying to embed the different instruments we have, the different drivers as well as instruments we have to improve the sustainability performance of PV systems. You can come up in a matrix which I've shown here on this slide. Excuse me, where you can basically identify a couple of drivers, dimensions of impact, and then map those against the instruments which are available today, right? And obviously, as mentioned on the previous slide, you can have regulatory drivers, you can have strong interest from investors. As lined out previously, we see an increased interest from the investment community on sustainability reporting. We also been through this rather comprehensive taxonomy process in the European Union over the last couple of years when it comes to green investments. So investors are clearly, one of the major drivers for increased sustainability performance of products. Then the customers, be it in the B2B environment, when it comes to institutional or bigger private purchases, but also the consumers, reflecting the versatility of PV and applications. Obviously, the end consumer is an interesting driver as well, industry peers and the society. And then in terms of dimensions of impact, these instruments obviously also have different avenues. They could be used as market access instruments. If you think about eco-design, for example, in the European Union, it is one thing that a product needs to fulfill to be able to be marketed in the market. Bankability obviously is another aspect where, again, investors, but also investors into projects want to be reassured that the sustainability performance allows them to de-risk their investment. Compliance is another dimension, and then obviously the value proposition overall to the customer. And then if you look at the different instruments available here for the PV industries, particular, you can identify a couple of initiatives which are voluntary, like the SVT Solar Scorecard, certainly one of the pilots, let's say, in the context of making sustainability performance more transparent. So the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition in the US implemented that almost a decade ago. Then what we are discussing today is really the combination of the EPEAT category listing for PV modules and inverters based on the Sustainability Leadership Standard, which addresses basically all dimensions I mentioned earlier and responds to the drivers which I listed earlier. And then we have this package of regulatory instruments on a mandatory side, the eco-design, but then also the voluntary EU eco-label, coupled closely to the green public procurement criteria. Then certain regulations which are only addressing parts of the life cycle, like the WEEE directive, since the waste stream is growing. The EU already back in 2012 took the decision to make recycling and take back mandatory for PV modules. So that is one part which is coupled to the recycling standard. And then there is also a more comprehensive life cycle assessment-based certification out there from the Cradle to Cradle scheme, which addresses some particular aspects along those lines. So to summarize that landscape, it is really that the EPEAT listing as well as the leadership standard from our point of view today provides the most comprehensive tool to really achieve the objectives lined out earlier on comparability, improvement, identifying improvement potentials, and then obviously driving the transition towards more sustainable products. So how was that comparability achieved, right? And I'm just listing two, aspects here which went into the development of that leadership standard, which has just been released for the combined product category of modules and inverters. Obviously, one of the challenges, for example, the SVT Solar Scorecard, which is mentioned here in the bottom left, faced is that to date, there's hardly, any standardized reporting of environmental, social governance, and sustainability performance available in the industry, right? Which makes it very, very difficult to compare and evaluate and benchmark, if not impossible. So in order to be able to meaningfully benchmark, you obviously need to have a level playing field and a standard on how to assess these different criteria. So in that regard, one of the major inputs into developing that standard was obviously also the product environmental footprint pilot project where SolarPower Europe was involved in over the last 5 years to develop these category rules for PV modules to kind of come to an accepted methodology on how to assess the life cycle impacts and identify hotspots in the life cycle of the PV modules. So having that robust and accepted life cycle assessment methodology available for multi-criteria environmental footprinting, and then also a commonly applicable set of broader sustainability and ESG indicators is basically the basis for that leadership standard and for the EPEAT category. So if we zoom into that, then obviously the purpose of that standard is to establish these criteria and exemplify the sustainability leadership in the market as lined out by the previous speaker through that tiered eco-label, type 1 eco-label, which is offered through EPEAT. And again, as mentioned before, the development of that standard went through a balanced multi-stakeholder process. It provides a technology-neutral, inclusive framework based on LCA. And it, develops a consensus-based definition of these key sustainability attributes and metrics, which are of relevance to the sector and which are of relevance, obviously, to the purchasers. So, in that sense, it is the first time that we have this globally applicable, robust and independently verified sustainability leadership benchmark with the opening of the EPEAT category next year. So zooming again further in, and this will be my transition into getting into more details on the different criteria which are used in the standard. I just wanted to give you an overview on how that EPEAT listing and how the leadership standard helped to address hotspots in the life cycle of PV systems, right? And that really comes back to what I said earlier, having the PEF in place to be able to identify these hotspots, i.e. these stages in the life cycle of a PV system which have the biggest environmental impact, will obviously help to design and shape incentives to address these hotspots and make the overall product inherently more sustainable, which in turn then has this ripple-on effect on, a more sustainable investment for investors into PV assets, and obviously a more sustainable electricity supply for purchasers of renewable electricity, because they basically get kilowatt hours with a lower environmental footprint, and that effectively decouples their use of electricity from negative environmental impacts, right? So it has pretty fundamental implications to get this right and to help to address these hotspots. And just zooming into 4 categories here, which have been identified, which are mineral, fossil, and renewable resource depletion. These are hotspots which can effectively be addressed through extended producer responsibility and high-value recycling, including the recovery of semiconductor materials and silver, the use of recycled content, right? And the mean to achieve that really is either a regulation, as listed here, the WE directive, which stipulates some quantitative targets. But going beyond the WE directive, we need some more leadership to be able to qualitatively also recover these materials, which are only included in the module or in the inverter in very tiny amounts. So specifying recycled content for those will actually most effectively drive this, the reduction of that hotspot. And that is something EPEAT can clearly achieve through the required and optional criteria defined in that category. Another example I wanted to quickly mention here is the particulate matter potential, but also human toxicity. I mean, if you look at that, if you look at these different indicators, you see that quite a bit, comes back to the supply chain and basically making sure that we minimize the impact we have from purchasing minerals, metals, but also electricity throughout the supply chain of the manufacturing of the PV module and the inverter to address the overall environmental footprint. And I think that this is a key challenge, obviously, for the PV industry as a whole to enable this circularity and to decouple, the own growth trajectory from the impacts which come with that. So that is basically now an overview here on the different categories which we have in the standard, which will obviously inform on whether a product is able to meet the EPEAT Bronze, EPEAT Silver, and EPEAT Gold category. And this is just listing as an example the different criteria areas which are similar for inverters, and then the different criteria which have to be met by default, i.e. Are required, which are the reddish ones here, and then the yellow ones are the voluntary ones, where you can basically get to a different tier if you meet those, right? So if you look at those categories, you can basically see that it starts with the management of substances, preferable materials use, life cycle assessment, energy efficiency and water use, end of life management designed for recycling. So the one I was just referring to, having quite a big impact on the hotspots in the life cycle, product packaging, and then also corporate responsibility, i.e. how do the manufacturers basically report on their ESG performance. Right, and then you basically can go through those and kind of have a look at those in the standard. But basically, those are designed to identify, the environmentally leading products in the market, which are basically able to fulfill all the required criteria. And as such, obviously, as the industry moves forward, there will be revisions coming, so that that overall curve is shifted towards the higher sustainability performance. So as mentioned, it is currently designed that only environmentally leading products, roughly one in the top third of the market, are expected to qualify for bronze level at date of publication, and then obviously even fewer products would be able to get to silver or gold level at the initial stage. So coming back to Nancy's presentation, and this is a little bit outdated, but I guess Nancy made it clear that the category will obviously only be launched once sufficient products are available to be listed, i.e. as the standard is now finally published, producers are starting to get certified with the certified accreditation bodies, and then once these certifications are done within the next 3 to 6 months, and the Green Electronics Council understands how many products are available, then that category will be launched. So December 2019 is kind of the kickoff year for the manufacturers to get certified, and then as we go through the first half year next year, we'll see how many manufacturers will actually be listed. So Yeah, I think that concludes my intervention here. Let me thank you for listening, and then yeah, looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much to both of you for a very insightful presentation, and actually very exciting. So it's really timely this webinar, because we are actually right now, as you just presented, in the process of the first certification for companies to comply with the EPEAT standard. One question that already popped up, and I think it's good to kick off the discussion, is what is the VAT added value for a manufacturing company to pursue an EPEAT certification? This is something you already touched upon, but maybe you want to elaborate a bit more on this, Andreas. Sorry, we've muted you. Now you should be able to speak.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think that is indeed the question. You know, why should a manufacturer go into that certification and get listed on EPEAT? And I clearly see, and I touched upon those aspects briefly during my presentation, a couple of drivers here. First of all, we see that sustainability criteria are more and more part of, be it requests for quotations from private investors, when it comes to tenders, when it comes to purchasing requirements from people who just buy modules. We have these kind of sustainability question block in these requirements, right? So one of the aspects for us, obviously, and that's really the big value for us, is that having a common framework and an EPEAT eco label, which is internationally recognized, not only by public purchasers, but also in the private sector, is obviously helping to drive standardization and comparability, right? So instead of having to come up with hundreds of different answers to hundreds of different surveys from purchasers, we can obviously refer to an EPEAT eco label saying, hey, we're bronze, silver, or gold level, and here are the criteria. So this will help you as a purchaser to tick the box, and that makes our life much easier. The second aspect I mentioned already relates to the financing, right? So as we have seen in the European Union and are increasingly seen all over the world, the aspect of sustainable finance becomes more and more critical and topical in terms of what initiatives we can take to channel investments into more sustainable assets, right? And obviously differentiating in that debate with the help of an EPEAT eco label to say, hey, this is clearly designed to identify the top third, and then even going further with the different tiers helps us to kind of communicate effectively, but also explain that, hey, by acknowledging and using the EPEAT eco label, it will also help you to de-risk your long-term investments, right? Because you're investing into something which has a lifetime of at least 25, 30 years, if not longer. So it is absolutely critical that you look into these different dimensions of sustainability. So I think that kind of differentiation and having that codified in a leadership standard and an eco label is certainly our main motivation as a manufacturer to say, hey, let's try to get our product qualified so that we have that common benchmarking opportunity, which we then can obviously use with purchasers, be it public or be it private purchasers.
I think it's very clear. One question that comes, and I think both of you can address it, is since what we have been talking about is the possible synergies of using the EPEAT as a basis for the EU eco label. Do you see any barriers on this implementation?
So this is Nancy from the Green Electronics Council, and we of course understand that EPEAT is a type 1 eco-label, so it is already utilized within the EU, and as such in the categories where EPEAT already provides available registered products, we really don't see that there would be a challenge with the use of EPEAT to meet EU purchaser needs in this area. And we are very proud organizationally to have been working very closely with those representatives within the EU who are assessing what criteria should be covered by any type of, be it GPP or the EU-driven eco-label. So as far as we are concerned, the only barriers that we could see is the lack of recognition of the work that's already been done, and potentially the need to redo work that's already been created by this multi-stakeholder group having come together and having developed these criteria. So we really do hope that there's a recognition of the value of all of the work that's already gone into the development of the standard that EPEAT has adopted and is using, and that that this is now an available tool available for EU purchasers. I hope that addresses the question.
Yes, I would say so. Andreas, do you want to integrate? Otherwise, we go on with the next question.
Yep. Maybe just one additional remark in that regard. I mean, Rafaela, we have been involved with the sustainability task force throughout the whole process with the JRC and Sevilla, as well as with the Commission. And I think the indications we are receiving from the Commission in terms of their willingness to take, the EPEAT into account when it comes to criteria discussions make me very, very looking very positive into a policy recommendation which would involve an EU eco-label that, the synergies will certainly be used there, and I don't think there is any intention to reinvent the wheel in that regard in the process, and kind of having a mutual recognition and using the synergies. I think that makes a lot of sense, and my take from the conversations over the last couple of years is that this is also the direction the Commission is progressing into.
Thanks. So let's see how that develops in the next months. We have a question, and let me rephrase because it's pretty long. So given that PV has a main driver, the reduction of carbon emissions, one might anticipate that embodied carbon would be a significant component of the new label. So can you speak to the role of embodied carbon in the new label? I think this is maybe for Nancy first, and then Andreas, if you want to integrate as well.
Thank you very much for that question. In fact, what I should have done at the start of my presentation is to actually highlight where are the specific criteria that Andres talked about during his presentation. So before we talk about the embodied carbon, let me make sure that all participants on this webinar are aware that you are able to access the specific criteria and also the verification requirements. So the EPEAT eco-label not only gives the criteria themselves, but also gives a statement as to how a manufacturer needs to prove that they are meeting those criteria. So both the criteria and the verification requirements are available on the Green Electronics Council website, and you can go there under EPEAT criteria. And in fact, you will be able to see all of the EPEAT criteria for each of our categories freely available there. So let me first share that information. Then as far as embodied carbon, that's a very good question. There are criteria associated with that, and we understand, as I said, that addressing climate change in our product categories are not only have been important, but are of course increasingly important. And so without going into too much detail, because I know that, Andreas, you talk a lot about this being an important aspect of the EPEAT label for PV manufacturers, but I do want to make clear that embodied carbon is one area, but that we are a life cycle and therefore as a life cycle eco-label address other impacts associated with climate change as well. But Andreas, did you want to talk in particular for this EP category and what you found to be relevant from a climate change impact perspective?
Sure, absolutely. I can add to that. I mean, there are basically a number of categories in the leadership standard which touch upon the topic of embedded carbon. And to just explain or take a step back, I think the important thing to understand is that EPEAT basically empowers purchasers to get a transparent view on what this embedded carbon looks like. So, for example, doing a life cycle assessment for a specific PV module or an inverter is a required criterion. And following, doing that life cycle assessment following a recognized procedure to do so is a required criterion. So enabling that transparency and a comparability of different products, including the life cycle, carbon footprint is obviously one of the aspects which will become more transparent through the standard and the application in EPEAT. And then another category which obviously addresses the greenhouse gas emissions relates to the use of certain chemicals in the production process. So there are some qualitative and quantitative criteria included in the standard. But most importantly, and I think that is again, closing the loop to the initial statement, where I clearly see the benefit is that having a required criteria on the life cycle assessment according to the rules, which makes it first of all transparent to the purchaser, and then the decision on the threshold criterion, i.e. saying, okay, I want my product to only have X grams of CO2 equivalent emissions per kilowatt hour, is obviously something the purchaser can decide upon, and or even a financier. I mean, if you look at the sustainable finance taxonomy, there is a mark in there saying that a certain threshold has to be met. I think that will always be subject to political discussion, but having that information available in a transparent and updated way is, I think, the added value EPEAT brings to the table, and then will basically enable these kind of discussions, right? So embedded carbon will clearly be visible, right? And that is something which I think today is only partially available to the public and to the people purchasing PV modules, and that will change with an EPEAT eco label.
Thanks. We have one attendee that asks a question on whether you're planning to get sub-suppliers engaged. So it brings the example of silicon suppliers, which can hold a large amount of embedded CO2 due to the electricity required to the production of silicon. Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, I can go first. I think that this is a very important question in looking at the industry today. Obviously, we are talking about global supply chains, which are rather complex or can be rather complex. And again, it comes back to the requirement of doing a life cycle assessment according to accepted methodologies like the product environmental footprint category rules or the International Energy Agency Task 12 guidelines. And that obviously involves including data from the supply chain, i.e. the silicon manufacturers, i.e. the manufacturers of the glass, the manufacturers of the raw materials. So including them in this process of doing a comprehensive LCA is a prerequisite, because in these methodologies I just referred to, you have data quality requirements which clearly specify that certain data can be generic, but certain data which directly relates to the product has to be gathered from the supply chain and has to be gathered from the manufacturer individually, right? So involving the supply chain will clearly be one part, which I also think is a step change, and a very positive step change that the supply chain becomes more transparent and more accessible also for life cycle assessments, because it is a requirement to do an LCA according to these methodologies. So to summarize the answer, I clearly see, yes, the supply chain is getting involved and has to supply data to basically do these LCA according to the requirements listed in the EPEAT criterion.
And then also we recognize that the supply chain really, not only for this product category, but for all product categories, that the Green Electronics Council is looking at and supporting purchasers in buying credible, sustainable products from those categories. Supply chain really needs to be an area that is addressed and increasingly is in the criteria. But one of the challenges, as Andreas talked about, is supply chains are complex, but also a number of the players within the tiers of the supply chain where impacts are being had are not necessarily large players as well. So the Green Electronics Council does have an initiative to support small and medium organizations, not only as producers available under the EPEAT eco-label, but also as participants in the global supply chains of these product categories. And the type of assistance that we provide is to help those organizations. Again, we follow the ITU definition of micro, small, and medium as far as enterprise size, but helping them understand how to capture the necessary data, retain that data, and then report that data out. Because increasingly the capacity to actually respond and provide that data to other participants within the supply chain is what will make a life cycle assessment possible. And so we think that we have to create additional transparency in the supply chain, but we also need to help build the capacity of players within those supply chains to do that.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time, so let's say a couple more questions and then we can close the session. One that I find interesting is regarding lead, because it's clearly something that is high on the agenda at the policy level, at least. Is there something in the EPEAT regarding lead? I understand that it's possibly among the categories that were addressed, such as chemical and resource consumption. So can you say a bit more about this?
Sure, I can start. Listed substances and chemicals, and we have a very comprehensive list based on an IEC standard there of classified substances which are commonly used in electronic products. That is a clear requirement that manufacturers who are using these either in the manufacturing process or in their product should declare that these materials are in there, which I think is also an important step towards enabling at a later life cycle stage, i.e. in the recycling, to be able to identify those substances and making sure they get recovered through minimum recycling standards. So lead is clearly part of that, like the same is true for cadmium compounds and a multitude of other compounds which are listed in that IEC standard. So that is a clear required criterion in the management of substances category, which addresses on disclosing those, making those publicly available, and then also ensuring that certain thresholds are being met. And this is true especially for inverters, as inverters are part of the scope of the ROS directive. The ROS directive, which restricts the use of certain materials in these products, is applicable. As some of you might know, or maybe all of you will know, the ROS directive excludes photovoltaic panels, so that criterion would not be applicable applicable for PV panels, but it is applicable for inverters. But overall and overarching, the disclosure of classified materials is part of the criteria sets for all products.
And as Andreas talked about, there are EPEAT always seeks to recognize regulatory requirements, and in fact, one of the benefits of the EPEAT eco-label is it has drawn attention to the lack of certain chemicals being covered by existing regulatory action. And so there is an assumption, since it has occurred with the other categories that EPEAT has covered, that chemicals which may not currently be covered under regulation but are highlighted as part of EPEAT are ones that may then be considered for regulation at a different time. Just because there's a recognition of the importance of those particular chemicals, but also these chemicals having been discussed and highlighted through a multi-stakeholder process, which means that a number of stakeholders within that product category recognize the impact of that particular chemical. So that is a function that in being highlighted in EPEAT, even though it may not be regulatory addressed right now, that may be something that's forthcoming that's happened previously in other EPEAT categories.
Thanks. As a final question, I would maybe like to address what you touched upon before, which is the revision of the criteria. So how do you ensure that the right level of ambition will be kept with the review of the criteria?
So thank you for that question. The Green Electronics Council recognizes that when institutional purchasers are supporting this eco-label with large-scale spend, that the impact of the eco-label needs to matter. And so we employ what is called a continuous maintenance process. That means we continuously look at where products are meeting the criteria. So obviously all criteria that are required must be met, but where are products meeting the optional criteria, and then assess whether or not, due to the percentage of products that are meeting optional, whether those should be considered for switching to required, and whether there should be the going back to the multi-stakeholder group and developing updated optional criteria. Again, those optional criteria should also reflect the innovation that's happening in the sector. Then there is a policy requirement, and this is not unique to EPEAT. Most eco-labels have a similar policy requirement of a full assessment of all criteria after 3 years to make sure that the criteria keep in line with the science findings that actually motivated the developing of the criteria. So EPEAT criteria are science-driven, and we do have a state of sustainability research packet that we complete at the start of the development of any category, and it's that research packet that looks at science each year that is the motivation for deciding whether or not to update all of the criteria at the close of 3 years. So there's both an ongoing continuous maintenance process that makes sure that required are leadership and that optional are really capturing the innovation that's happening in the marketplace. And then at the close of every 3 years, there's a full assessment driven by the understanding of what science is saying at that time for that particular product category about whether or not the criteria should all go through an entire updating, or whether or not we can continue with the existing criteria and just continue with continuous maintenance. And that happens every 3 years.
Thanks. That's very clear. With 5 minutes over time, I would like to conclude this session. So thanks again to Nancy and to Andreas for sharing these very informative insights with us, and thank you for the attendees for participating in the webinar. Please keep an eye for our upcoming events. We have webinars in the pipeline, as well as some larger events that will be announced soon. We also have the Solar Power Summit organized in March, and registrations have opened. So if you're interested, please register as soon as you can. And with these words, then I would like to conclude and thank you very much and wish you a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.